This is chapter 2 of Tatsuya Higaki's book, Nishida Katoro's Philosophy of Life. Chapter 2 is titled The Function of Self-Awareness, Self-Determination Within Infinity. An introduction to self-awareness. Normally, self-awareness is understood as one's awareness of oneself. It is this act of reflecting on oneself, of re-evaluating one's place. This is what is normally meant by self-awareness. Nishida's theory of self-awareness also involves this normal sense of the term. However, we must keep in mind that for Nishida, who argues from the perspective of pure experience, there is no such thing as a previously given domain of the self. Self-awareness is then not the act of discerning a pre-existing self. Rather, it is the act of creating, actualizing from a virtual state, the I and the world by distinguishing them within the pure experience that lives according to an infinite flow. Self-awareness is a term that was introduced by Nishida that indicates how we should consider the infinity of relationships within pure experience. It is a term that refers to the act whereby concrete events arise through determination within the pure experience that lives an infinite flow. In this sense, self-awareness is the self-determination of experience within infinity. Nishida discusses self-awareness mainly in a book entitled Intuition and Reflection in Self-Awareness, which consists of 40-odd short fragments. His book, The Problem of Consciousness, 1920, will also be helpful in this connection. Like all Nishida's books that were written after an inquiry into the good, it is very difficult to see at first what the main topic of intuition and reflection in self-awareness is about. Nishida himself describes the work as the document of a hard-fought battle. And indeed, one can see that in this book, he is re-examining his own theory of the systems that he had attained in his theory of pure experience. The discussion of the book proceeds while incorporating various contemporaneous ideas, such as those of Fichte, Neo-Kantianism, and Bergson. Through trial and error, Nishida develops the issues involved in pure experience in various directions. The texts on self-awareness are therefore especially intricate. They contain, in germinal form, many of the arguments that Nishida will clearly develop in his later years. However, in order to disentangle these intricate arguments, I will focus on 2 points. The first is the question of what self-awareness is, namely, what is the particular logical structure that self-awareness possesses. The second point is the question, why was it necessary for Nishida to tenaciously engage with mathematical theories of the differential, infinity, and set theory in thinking about the logic of self-awareness? My aim is to show, through an examination of these 2 points, how Nishida reconceives the issues of the present and the infinite that he had faced in his reflections on pure experience. What is self-awareness? At the beginning of Intuition and Reflection in Self-Awareness, Nishida introduces the topic of self-awareness by discussing the themes of intuition and reflection. Intuition is an ever-progressing consciousness where subject and object are undifferentiated, where the knower and the known are one, and where reality is just as it is. Reflection is a consciousness that stands outside of this progression and sees it from afar. I think that it is our self-awareness that allows us to see the internal relation between these 2 states. Reading this, we see that self-awareness is conceived in connection with intuition and reflection. Here, intuition is an act of living pure experience, of uniting oneself with the reality of infinite flow. It refers to a way of grasping things in accordance with the temporal flow itself. The indivisible flow is discerned as the flow itself by intuition. On the other hand, reflection is the act of reconceiving the experience of the temporal flow in a spatial manner. It is the act of detaching oneself from living the flow itself and regrasping the flow. Reflection is this kind of regrasping of the flow. What is important here, however, is that even in reflection, it is impossible to separate oneself from the reality of intuition, as if one were making a map of the flow of the sky. That is, reflection cannot be detached from the movement of the flow. Self-awareness is introduced as something that connects intuition and reflection. It is the link between the infinite living of intuition and the reflection that regrasps it. Let me rephrase this. To be in a state of pure experience is to be completely within a flow. It is to live a state of virtuality, which is a force of differentiation. Reflection, which takes the form of spatialization, can then be understood as the differentiation and actualization of this virtuality. Through such reflection, the forces of differentiation manifest themselves and become clear. The act of regrasping, however, can only be performed from within the flow. That is, it can only be an act of determining infinite differences from within the infinity of the flow. Nishida, therefore, argues that self-awareness is an infinitely progressing or act of self-development. Self-awareness is an act that actualizes the system of pure experience and further develops it as a flow in accordance with pure experience. Nishida's self-awareness and Bergson's pure duration. In order to consider the logic of self-awareness, let us examine its overlap with Bergson's theory of pure duration. As we have seen, for Bergson, pure duration is an indivisible continuity. Therefore, even when one is depicting the individual I or an individual object, these are always conceived of as arising from the basis of a continuous flow. A typical logic that displays this development is the logic of dissociation that takes up in the context of perception and memory. Regarding this, Bergson writes roughly as follows. Let us consider, for instance, the recollection of an image from an infinite string of memories. In traditional psychology, this is understood in terms of association. The theory of association is the theory that there are pre-existing individual images, and that these images are connected together and actualized through the operation of some logic, such as resemblance or contiguity. According to this theory, the recollection of a certain memory occurs through the discernment of a resembling memory and contiguous situation. For instance, the recollection of a certain person is made possible by externally linking together various elements pertaining to that person. Bergson, however, does not employ this idea of association. Memory is from the outset a virtual, mutually interpenetrating, connected series. The memory of a certain person is like a nebula. It is situated within a virtual internal network of various memories pertaining to that person. Recollection is to disentangle this intricate network. The association of memories is, therefore, nothing but a logic of the restructuring of memories that have already been differentiated and actualized. What we must consider is how, prior to this, an image could have been virtually connected with countless other images. We must dive immediately, so to speak, into the network of images. That is, when something arises, what we must explain is not how the image becomes concretized through connections, associations. It is rather the opposite. Everything that exists in this world is already connected with everything else. To exist within a flow of relationships is to bear the infinity of virtual relationships. Thus, what is most important for the transformation of memory into an image is the act that disentangles the connections within the virtual state, so that something individual can be extracted. It is the act whereby something is dissociated as an individual from the domain of undifferentiated differences. What we must inquire into is the mechanism of dissociation within infinity. Nishida's theory of self-awareness is deeply linked with this problem discussed by Bergson. For Nishida, pure experience is a flow where the subject and object are undifferentiated. Thus, there is no I that is presupposed, nor are there any objects on the side of the world. However, in order for this undifferentiated and continuous flow to act as something concrete, it must somehow differentiate and unfold itself. Otherwise, there would be no way for the infinitely continuous pure experience to actualize its differences. This actualization through differentiation is none other than self-reflection. The I, which is a single moment of the flow, arises as something reflective, and likewise the world itself, which was presented as a flow, becomes actualized as something individual in the differentiation of the flow through reflection. Experience determines itself. That which is determined is objective, the act that determines itself. Thus, that act of dissociation is subjective. The I is something that appears through this kind of reflection. Likewise, various objects arise through actualization. Both the I and objects are objective entities that are determined in this manner. Nishida says that the act of dissociation that performs this determination is subjective. Here, the reflection that extracts virtual differences and actualizes them overlaps as an act with the intuition that grasps the flow. It is this overlapping that Nishida tries to capture through his theory of self-awareness. The infinite development of self-awareness. The significance of the fact that Nishida developed his theory of self-awareness as an extension of the theory of pure experience will become clear when we view it from the perspective of the determination of infinity. We will see that his theory of self-awareness was, in a way, an attempt to reconceptualize the difficulty involved in the theory of pure experience, the difficulty of simply expanding presentism, that is, the problem of depicting the whole as a hypostatization through the simple expansion of the present. We will also see that infinitely broad virtuality of pure experience, as well as the interplay between this virtuality and actuality. Here, let us examine in more detail how intuition and reflection overlap in self-awareness. The act of reflection that actualizes events cannot itself be detached from the infinite act of intuition. Rather, it is something that drives this infinite act. This is related to Nishida's description of self-awareness in terms of the development of a mechanism that mirrors itself within itself. The self's reflection on itself, its mirroring itself, does not yet come to an end at this point, for it consists of an infinite process of unification. When the self, on itself, reflects on itself or mirrors itself, it does not do so detached from the self, as when experience is mirrored in the form of concepts. Rather, the self mirrors itself within itself. Whatever differentiates and develops in this way does not acquire force from the outside. Rather, the self-same one mirrors within itself. That is, consciousness is a process in which the virtual totality develops itself. Of course, we cannot immediately say that the virtual one and manifest one are identical, but our immediate experience is such an endless process of fluctuations of consciousness. Nishida is saying two things here. The first is that since self-awareness is the act of determining pure experience, its nature is to mirror itself within itself. Therefore, ostensibly, there arises a distinction between the virtual self, wherein the act of mirroring, intuiting, takes place, and the manifest self, which is mirrored, reflected. The act of determination in self-awareness consists in the arising of this manifestation, the actual something. But what is even more important here is that this act of reflection and pure self-awareness can only function within the dynamic network of pure experience. The act of reflection is not a movement from pure experience to something else. The actual thing that arises through reflection is not something utterly external, like a mere object or concept. Rather, the act of actualization itself, again, gives rise to virtuality, and hence differences. Thus, self-awareness forms an infinite series. Drawing a map that depicts oneself. Nishida's following account will be helpful in considering the dynamic identity of self-awareness. Citing the American philosopher Josiah Royce, he gives the following example. Suppose one were in the United Kingdom and planned to make a complete map of the country. To draw a complete map of the UK from within the UK, and hence to draw a map that depicts oneself, is analogous to the act of actualizing oneself in self-awareness. To draw this kind of map, the act of drawing itself would have to be reflected in what is drawn. Thus, each realization of this plan would immediately give rise to the project of drawing another, even more complete map, resulting in an infinite process. Again, Nishida writes that an object between two mirrors reflects its figure infinitely. In this kind of act, the actualization that arises through self-awareness again generates new differences in the domain of virtuality, thus endlessly demanding further actualizations. Bergson also discusses the interplay between virtuality and actuality using the image of the mirror. Furthermore, Deleuze in his Cinema cites Bergson's theory and discusses the indistinguishability of virtuality and actuality. Both these accounts discuss the difficulty of overlaying the present, the actualized, due to its being present, directly on the flow, the virtual. In Nishida's theory of self-awareness, the present is no longer depicted as something that is flatly expanded to infinity. Rather, the present is a place of dynamic acts where the virtual and the actual resonate with each other. For Bergson, the past, the virtual, is something that possesses a difference in nature from the present, the actual. The past is not something that has once become present and then is transformed, for instance, by the psychological reduction of its force. In that case, there would only be a difference of degree between the two. Rather, according to Bergson, the present is something that is cancelled within the flow. The present can also be characterized as a mere peak of the past virtuality that constitutes the major part of the flow. Therefore, in contrasting the past and the present, Bergson rejects the view that places the present at the center and instead regarded the present as a single phase of the actualization of the past, virtuality, and thus as something of a different nature from the past. But in that case, how does the past, virtuality, itself arise? If the present is regarded as the peak of the flow of virtual past, then the question becomes, how did the past come into being? Here, Bergson argues that in the progression of the flow, the present and past are two different directions that are differentiated by splitting. And in order to illustrate this differentiation of directions, he employs the metaphor of the mirror. The virtual is an image of the actual, reflected on the surface of a mirror. He describes the present as a place where images simultaneously split into the actual and virtual. However, what if we reconceive of this present within the flow? In that case, the actual world itself can only be something that arises from the determination of the virtual. Thus, are not actual and virtually two things that reciprocally mirror each other, as if they were grasping each other's tail? This is none other than Deleuze's theme of the indistinguishability of the virtual and the actual. This overlaps with the infinite act of drawing a map that depicts oneself. The virtual and the actual that bifurcates at the peak of the present cannot be captured by the merely static framework of the object in front of a mirror and the image of that object in the mirror. Insofar as the actual itself arises through the determination of the virtual, this mirror scheme cannot be regarded as anything but an infinitely progressing mutual reflection of actuality and virtuality. In this sense, self-awareness should be understood as the place of an infinite act. Nishida's theory of self-awareness does not deal with a mere present that has a sphere, as in his theory of pure experience. Rather, it extracts the moving, infinite reflection of actualization, virtualization, as the process of pure experience itself. Self-awareness, which is itself the production of infinity, unfolds its structure on the basis of pure experience. The theory of self-awareness re-examines the presentism of pure experience in the context of the infinitely dynamical. Here, one gets a glimpse into the issue of the infinitude of the flow, an issue that cannot be grasped by the idea of simply expanding the present. This infinitude becomes the next focal point of Nishida's thought. The differential and the theory of infinity. We've seen how the theory of self-awareness steps into the issue of the continuity of flowing reality in a dynamic way. The theory focuses on further inquiry into the related issues of infinity. In order to discuss this subject, Nishida, during this period, frequently referred to differential calculus and set theory, that is, mathematical ideas that deal with infinity. Notwithstanding the general image of Nishida as a religious philosopher who developed an Eastern philosophy of nothingness, reference to mathematics and science comprise a considerable portion of his corpus. There was a period in which he aspired to be a mathematician, and he was well acquainted with mathematical discussions. Therefore, Neo-Kantianism, which Nishida had been studying at the time, frequently employed mathematical arguments. Reference to Cohen constitutes the major part of Nishida's mathematical discussions. And above all else, it was a period of fluidity when fundamental revolutions were taking place in the foundation of mathematics. Nishida frequently referred to Georg Cantor, who developed set theory and the foundations of mathematics. There is no doubt that all of these factors contributed in sharpening Nishida's mathematical ideas. The use of mathematics is especially conspicuous in intuition and self-reflection, in self-awareness, and the problem of consciousness. This is, in a sense, inevitable, given that the theory of self-awareness, as I mentioned earlier, must deal with the infinitude of the continuum of the flow in a dynamic way. Let us begin by considering the relation between self-awareness and the differential. Nishida writes as follows: here, x is a variable, and dx is an ideal infinitesimal that constitutes the ground of the mathematical differentiation. Usually it is written in the form dy over dx. Quote, for a sense quality to be perceived, there must be something universal as the basis of that perception. And that universal must be something immanent within experience. It must be something like dx in relation to x in mathematics. This is probably why the Marburg school understands the infinitesimal to be the basis of reality, just as we regard dx as the foundation of finite x in analysis, so we perceive a given sense quality as the determination of a continuous totality. We can think of a finite curve as arising from the infinitesimal point. We can think of dx as the origin of x. Can we not understand the relation between our finite consciousness and the infinite unconscious that lies at its base in terms of the relation between the finite and the infinite in the sense described above? Can we not understand the unconscious that lies beyond our finite consciousness as something like dx in relation to x? What is it that Nishida is trying to say when employing this notion of the differential? He is trying to describe the form by which the finite actual arises from the infinite virtual as a determination of self-awareness. Nishida continues his discussion of the differential in a concrete way by taking up the consciousness of straight lines and the consciousness of colors. Any real straight line is infinite, by definition. If it is not infinite, then it is not a straight line. However, when we become conscious of the straight line, we are subjecting the infinity of the line to the determination. It is by subjecting the infinitely expanding virtual line to determination that we are able to conceive of it as finite, actual line. This is the structure of consciousness. But behind consciousness, unconsciousness is enclosed, so to speak. Again, colors come in an infinite multitude of variations. Behind the existence of any color lies the bloom and buzz of an infinity of colors. But in order to become conscious of any color, the color must be actualized from color in itself, which possesses an infinite multitude of implications. That is, determination must take place. This kind of determination has an infinite multitude of variations as its backdrop. It is pure experience, as intuition, that feels this kind of infinite line or infinite color. It is something like an, quote, artist with pure vision seeing a curve within a straight line, or a tendency towards black and white within every color. It signifies the dx of mathematical differentiation because it is infinite. This dx is something that we cannot become conscious of in a clear way, but we become aware of its existence by existing within it. But when we try to grasp it as something distinct, it flies away. It is something real and given in immediacy, but insofar as it is invisible, it can only be described as something ideal. In contrast, consciousness, that is, the appearance of something by way of self-awareness, is the determination of that something from a state of immersion into the infinite variation. It is the x in relation to dx. It is the establishing of something concrete as opposed to the idea. It is the establishment and actualization of a center within an infinite flow. Here, one must bear in mind that for Nishida, what is real is the infinite dx. What is real is the continuous idea. The colors and the straight lines that one sees are not real. These are mere aspects of reality. In other words, since the real straight line and real color are infinitely connected, we cannot see them with our eyes. They are invisible, ideal things. To make them visible is to extract reality from a certain perspective and determine it. Through determination, a straight line becomes a visible line, and a color becomes present to consciousness. But this also causes the infinity implied in experience to be scraped off. This kind of finitude is what is taking place in self-awareness, our concrete acts of consciousness. Deleuze presents a theory parallel to this of Nishida, described above. In Difference and Repetition, he illuminates the indeterminate forces of differentiation by using the mathematical concept of the differential. The task of his ontology of becoming is to give an account of how events differentiate through mathematical differentiation. From infinity to intensive magnitude/intensity. These discussions can be said to fall within the sphere of the theme of intensive magnitude. What is intensive magnitude? It is a magnitude that is presented in contrast to extended magnitude. It is the reality of the heterogeneous and continuous flow that was presented by Bergson. The extensive magnitude is a magnitude formed by a collection of mutually external parts, a magnitude that can be measured by homogeneous and spatial divisions. It is a whole made by piling up of parts. In contrast, intensive magnitude is something qualitative that develops in mutual interpenetration within the flow. It is a magnitude that forms a heterogeneous manifold and expresses the indivisible continuity of time. Intensive magnitude is something that can only be discerned in such a way that the whole is prior to its parts, which arise through determination from the totality. In this sense, intensive magnitude, to use Cohen's phrase, is a continuous production. The theory of intensive magnitude as a way of illustrating the ideal infinite force, a force that is real and given in immediacy, but is itself invisible, links with the theory of the differential. Intensive magnitude, according to Nishida, was taken up by Kant, but was not yet made clear by him. The significance of intensive magnitude was first made clear by Cohen and his treatment of the differential. Both Nishida and Deleuze refer to the theme of intensive magnitude when dealing with the differential. To use Deleuze terminology, intensive magnitude is intensity. Both Nishida and Deleuze, who discuss the differential, share this theory of intensive magnitude/intensity. In a sense, it is an inevitable theory for a philosophy of life that is developed under the influence of Neo-Kantianism. Why a discussion of numbers? Nishida further expands his theory of infinity in order to examine the continuity of intensive magnitude. In this connection, he frequently takes up a discussion of Cantor. Nishida's examination may be insufficient from the perspective of the foundations of mathematics. That is because, at this point, Nishida had not yet attained an understanding of the paradoxes involved in the theory of infinity. It is only in his later years, when he discusses the absolute contradictory self-identity, that he faces the logic of Cantor's theory of infinity itself. Nevertheless, Nishida's reference to set theory contains many interesting ideas. An example is Nishida's discussion of cardinal numbers and the ordinal numbers. In this discussion of Cantor, Nishida takes up the difference between them. He describes a cardinal number as a number of the world of mere representation, that is, the determined consciousness. Cardinal numbers possess no order. They are numbers of a homogeneously depicted space. In contrast, when one deals with the infinite continuum itself, or to use Cantor's terminology, the transfinite number of infinite cardinality, ordinal numbers become significant. Here, according to Nishida, the ideal becomes real, relations become real. He describes an ordinal number as a number that deals with a qualitative and hence intensive phenomena, such as the saturation level of red, and thus in the hue of the color red. Here, one calls Deleuze's distinction between the cardinal number and ordinal number in difference and repetition, where he takes up the third synthesis of time, which deals with becoming itself. Like Nishida, he presented the ordinal number as a concept that displays the temporality of intensity. The issue for both Nishida and Deleuze is, of course, the issue of infinity. In illustrating the infinitude of the ideal continuum as what is real, both of these thinkers take up the concept of number dealt with in set theory. Perhaps this was another inevitable consequence involved in a philosophy of life. It could be objected that this is only the instance of philosophers adopting a rigorous mathematical theory to fit their own interests. However, as we have seen, Nishida and Deleuze's references to the differential calculus and set theory are not eccentric appeals, nor are they presenting a mere analogy between philosophy and mathematics. For the use of mathematics can be said to be inevitable when dealing ontologically with the virtual infinity of the flow itself and in disentangling the heterogeneously continuous intensive magnitude of the flow. Insofar as the philosophy of life posits the ideal totality as something given from the outset and attempts to discern a method for depicting this as something other than a flat expansion of the present, the reference to mathematics can be said to be inevitable. This and other related issues of intensive magnitude will resurface in various forms in Nishida's discussions of absolute nothingness and the absolute contradictory self-identity, as it is one of his underlying themes. But while the discussion of the continuity of the flow develops into an issue of intensity, there is another discussion that is inserted between the two. This is the discussion of place as the foundation upon which discourse of the flow can take place.